Now, referring to the children of Israel who Joshua and Caleb were just heartbrokenly saying, let's go. We can take the land. My God has done everything so far, He'll drive the enemies out. And what had the majority said? Can't do it. See? Can't do it. In fact, I was thinking as I was preparing for these over the last week, I've said it before in this program, I'll say it again. When it comes to the things of the Spirit, always remember the majority is rarely right. Never forget that. The majority is rarely right. They're usually wrong. And so it was here. The 10 were the majority, but they were dead wrong. Caleb and Joshua were right. All right, but now I'll read on. But with whom was he grieved those 40 years? Verse 17, was it not with them who had sinned, whose carcasses fell in the wilderness? And to whom sware he that they should not enter into his rest, but to them that, what? Believe not. See, that was their problem. So then, Paul writes in verse 19, so then we see that they could not enter in, that is, and remember, that's the opposite of faith. And that's why he also says, and in this same book of Hebrews, that without faith, it is impossible to please Him. As we act on it. Only you have two opposite results. All right, still continuing on now then. Why is God dealing with the nation of Israel so harshly? Follow with me now to Acts chapter 2. Now this is Peter preaching on the day of Pentecost. This is only 50 days after the crucifixion. Still fresh on everyone's mind. 50 days, that's not very long. It's only 7 weeks. Now in Acts chapter 2, come down to, let's see, verse 36. Again, for sake of time. Someday we're going to be studying the book of Acts verse by verse, but until then we'll just have to jump in and out. Acts chapter 2, verse 36. Peter is preaching to this tremendous Jewish crowd. They're there for the Jewish feast day of Pentecost from every nation under heaven. And he says, therefore, let all the house of Israel. Now watch it. Does that include Gentiles? All the house of Israel know assuredly that God hath made that same Jesus whom you did what? Crucified. Now what is Peter saying? You killed your Messiah. Plain English. Whom you crucified. And of course, that shook them up. And so what was their response? Well, men and brethren, what must we do? All right, now come on over to chapter 3, and I want you to see the same kind of language. Acts chapter 3. And again in verse 12, you determine who Peter is talking to. And this is what's so intrinsic in Bible study. Always ask yourself, well, to whom is this being addressed? Sure, it's for our learning, but it's not speaking to us. I trust there isn't one of you in here whose pastor gets up on Sunday morning and points the finger at you and say, you killed the Christ. Does he? No. But Peter does. Peter says here now in chapter 3, beginning verse 12, ye men of Israel, why marvel at this? In other words, they had just healed the lame man. Verse 13, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers, hath glorified His Son Jesus, whom you delivered up and denied in the presence of Pilate. Verse 14, you denied the Holy One and the Just One. Now verse 15, and I can put in the pronoun you for clarification, and you, what's the next word? Killed, see? And you killed the Prince of Life. All right, now then as you come down to verse 19, what's the first word? Repent. Well, repent of what? They have just rejected and killed and murdered their Messiah. See that? Now this is still on God's mind. The nation of Israel has not yet been forgiven of the fact that they rejected and killed and crucified their Messiah. Now, I'm always very careful as I teach this in my classes that this does not come across as an excuse for anti-Semitism. Now, we know a lot of the religions of the world for the last 1900 years have accused the Jew of being the God killers, of being the ones who killed the Christ. But in reality, you see, as Christ hung on the cross, no Jew took his life, no Roman took his life, but who did? He gave it up of his own will. But in God's dealing with the covenant people, you see, and why he's dealing with them the way he does, Peter, according to inspiration here, is accusing the nation of Israel for having killed their Messiah. All right, now let's go all the way over to Romans and see what Paul says about the whole thing. And we know that because Israel rejected their Messiah, they lost their temple, they lost their land, and they were into a dispersion, and they've been in the ghettos, they've been through the Holocaust, and all because, you see, they rejected all the promises. But God also promised from day one that he would not give up on them, that one day he would yet bring them back, he would bring them to the land, and he's yet going to fulfill all the promises that he made to their forefathers. Now we pick this up in Romans chapter 11 from Paul's viewpoint. And remember now, Paul has a heart for the nation of Israel, but he is, as you'll see here in verse 13 of Romans 11, he is not the apostle of Israel, as Peter certainly was, but rather his apostleship is to whom? Gentile. Now look at that verse 13. For Paul writes, I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles. See? And he says, I magnify my office. In other words, he's never going to shrink from that responsibility. All right, now then back up in this chapter, and you will find in verse 11, where Paul is defending the nation of Israel, that they are not going to be completely annihilated. God is still going to finish his program with them. But he says in verse 11, I say then, have they, that is the nation of Israel, stumbled that they should fall, that God should destroy them? God forbid, or banish the thought. But rather through their fall, salvation is come to who? To the Gentiles. See that? Now then, verse 12, if the fall of them be the riches, then what in the world is going to be, reading on now, if the fall of them, verse 12, be the riches of the world, and diminishing of them the riches of the Gentiles, how much, what's the next word? More their fullness. See? So their great future is still ahead of them. But God is still dealing with them on the basis of what they had done in their unbelief. All right, now let's come on into chapter 11 a little further to verse 25. After establishing the fact that God will yet come back and restore the nation of Israel to its original promises and to its covenant position, he gives us a time frame. And so he says in verse 25, I would not, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, or this secret, which was never revealed before, lest ye be wise in your own conceit, that blindness, a spiritual blindness, in part, not forever, but for a period of time, has happened to Israel until, now I'm always telling you that word is a time word. In other words, Israel is in her position only until God has finished his work with the Gentile. And he takes us out of the way, and then the blindness will be lifted from the Jew. Now then come into verse 26. And here's the verse I said that so many people, I think, have taken out of context, or they don't understand what it says. And it says, and so all Israel shall be saved. How much? All. But what did we see back in Zechariah? Only a third. And we know that all through Israel's history, did God ever get 100%? What's the word? Few. Remnant, or few. The remnant of Israel. But then why does Paul say, and yet all Israel shall be saved? Well, there's a biblical explanation, of course, like there always is. Come back with me a minute to Isaiah. Just about had a mental block. Isaiah, chapter 9. Isaiah chapter 9, drop down to verse 8. And then for those of you that are a little faster than the others, you can already look back to Genesis 32. If we have time, we're going to go back there, and then we'll wind up the half hour. All right, but here in Isaiah 9, Verse 8, the Lord sent a word into Jacob, that is the nation, and it, the word, lighteth upon, what's the next word? Israel. He sent the word to Jacob, but only Israel heard. Well, now I thought they were one and the same. Oh, we got 3 minutes. Back, fast, to Genesis, chapter 32. That's the only thing I don't like about the television deal is this 30-minute press on time. See, when we teach 2 hours on a night, why, it's a lot easier, isn't it? Genesis, chapter 32. Drop all the way into verse 27 and 28. And here's Jacob with that all-night wrestling with the Lord, with Jehovah, the man. And after they've been wrestling all night, the Lord, verse 27, says to Jacob, what is thy name? And he said, Jacob. Now verse 28, and he said, thy name shall be called no more Jacob. Now what did Jacob mean? The deceiver, the supplanter. Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. And Israel means a prince with God. So what have you got? A whole new man. Israel was the believing Jacob, who is now called Israel. Jacob referred to his unbelieving state. And so now he is to be called Israel. Now you take this into the verse in Isaiah chapter 9, the word came to Jacob, but only Israel heard. What does that tell you? Only the believer, see? And the same way now as he deals with the end time, 2/3 of Israel are not going to believe. 1/3 will. And that third will be called Israel. And so then, how much of Israel will be saved? All of Israel. See that? And so if you just begin to define some of these terms, then everything just begins to fall in place. Not every Jew is going to be saved, but all of the believing remnant of Israel will be saved.
Thank you for watching Through the Bible with Les Feldick, a weekly Bible study. If you would like more information about the Les Feldick Ministries, a Bible study in your area, or about this program, write to Les Feldick Ministries, Route 1, Box 760, Kinta, Oklahoma, 74552. That's Route 1, Box 760, Kinta, Oklahoma, 74552. Thank you, and be sure to tune in next time for Through the Bible with Les Feldick. Hello and welcome to Through the Bible with Les Feldick. An Oklahoma rancher and farmer, Les Feldick has been teaching homestyle Bible classes for 20 years in Iowa, Oklahoma, and Texas. Les Feldick's unique style of Bible teaching has made the books of the Bible come to life. When Les is teaching, it's so interesting that people say time just seems to fly by. And now, here is Les Feldick.
Okay, good to have everybody back once again, and we're going to go right into the book because time always seems to get away from us. So turn with me to Matthew 24. Of course, we always like to invite our television audience to get your book and follow these things with us. Take your notes, and if you have any questions, give us a call on that toll-free number, and a lot of times we can answer a question over the phone or write to us or whatever. We'll be glad to help in any way we can. All right, now in Matthew 24, beginning with verse 15, we're going to pick up this remnant that we talked about in the last program that I feel will be the 1/3 that will survive the horrors of the tribulation. And Jesus speaks of it, and so if he speaks of it, we can rest on it, because after all, he's the author of all of history. He's the author of our salvation. He's the author of eternity. And certainly he is the author of this book. And so now he says in verse 15, Matthew 24, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. Now, we just looked at that a program or two ago, and I'm not going to have you go back again to Daniel chapter 9. But you remember in 9 verse 27, it says that in the middle of the week he will go into the temple and he will defile it. And that will be in the middle of the tribulation, at the end of 3.5 years. All right, so now Jesus is clearly defining that this event is what Daniel was talking about. Now in verse 16 he said, then. In other words, when the word suddenly goes out that the Antichrist has come into the temple and defiled it, and I wouldn't doubt but that since they will be back into animal sacrifices and the altar will be operating, he will probably, just out of orneriness and demonism and what have you, he will offer a hog. That's what I think he'll do, because that is anathema to a Jew, you know, to think of a hog being slaughtered and its blood spilled on their altar. But whatever, he's going to defile the temple, and he will then immediately turn on the Jew. All right, so then verse 16, Jesus said, then let them who be in Judea flee to the mountains. Now, we talked about this several months ago, but again, since it's in line with our study of book of Revelation, we're going to repeat it. Verse 17. Now, I want you to watch as we come down through these verses that this is not a group of just one age or one sex. This is a mixed group of people. All right, let him who is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Now, we've explained this once before, that these are probably Jewish people living in the area of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv and what have you, who are maybe retired, are living fairly high on the hog, if I may use that expression. They're living a good lifestyle. And so they have this leisure time on the housetop. And so the admonition is, don't even stop to take extra clothes. Then he goes to another group of people in verse 18, neither let him who is in the field. Now that includes, of course, the younger people, the ones who are still in working and production and what have you. And so neither let him who is in the field return back to take his clothes. Also, he shouldn't take time to do anything, but from wherever he may be presently working, be ready to take off for the mountains. Then verse 19, Jesus says, woe unto them that are with child. In other words, you have your young pregnant women and expecting. And they're also included. So now you've got your well-to-do, retired people. You've got the working class people. Now we come down to the young mothers and mothers-to-be, as well then as in verse 19, continuing on, to those that are nursing mothers. It's going to be hard for them. It's going to be hard for some young gal that's almost ready to deliver to make this long trek down to the mountains, which I think will be to the southeast of Jerusalem, probably to the area of Petra. Possibility. I'm not saying it is, but it's a possibility. And then he comes to verse 20, and notice now that this is an indication that the Jew will be back under the law. For he says, pray or beg that your flight be not in the winter, so that they would have to suffer cold and snow and rain and ice, and that can happen in the area of Israel. And pray that it won't happen on the Sabbath day. Now, according to law, you see, they were limited as to how far they could walk on the Sabbath day. And Jesus said, you better pray that this doesn't happen on the Sabbath day, otherwise the law would limit them from being able to escape. Now, as we look at this whole scenario, I always like to remind the folks that I teach, flash back to the Exodus out of Egypt. So much of this is almost identical. Now, whether it will be in numbers or not, I'm not sure. But nevertheless, the scenario is so much the same. They're going to have this great number of Jews suddenly, just providentially moving out to a distant place. Now then, verse 21. Here Jesus makes it so plain that since this is in the middle now of the tribulation, for then, in other words, from this point on, this last 3.5 years, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time nor ever shall be. Now think what that covers. That covers all of the horrible experiences that Israel had in Old Testament days. This covers the horrors of the Holocaust. This covers the horrors of famine and war that the world has experienced in the last generation. And none of that can measure up to what these last 3.5 years are going to be. And he says, verse 22, and except those days should be shortened. Now, from what I can get out of the Greek word shortened, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden instead of 3.5 years, it's only going to be 3 years, but the word means unless it would end right on schedule. In other words, if this 3.5 years would go an extra month, not a soul would survive. It's going to be so awful. But there will be survivors, and we'll be seeing that in lessons to come, that even under the terrible, cataclysmic events of the final 3.5 years, yet there will be survivors all around the world. All right? Verse 22 then again, except those days should be shortened or brought to its timely end, there should no flesh be saved, but for the elect's sake. In other words, for those that will be believers going into the kingdom. Now, never lose sight of this. We have to have flesh and blood believers to go into the kingdom. And so the Lord will have to stop this before all of them are killed, or there would be no one for the regeneration of the human race in the kingdom economy. So unless this should be brought to its timely end, there would be no flesh saved. But since it will end on time, there will be survivors. And of course, like I said, we'll pick that up back in Isaiah. All right, now then let's go to Revelation. Chapter 6 again, because after all, that's where we've been. We're studying the book of Revelation. And you remember in this chapter 6, we were looking at the seals. Those seals that were on the outside of this scroll out of Revelation 5, which you remember was indicative of a mortgage. And we've seen this mortgage being opened up now by taking off the triggering mechanisms for events in time. First, the white horse, which was a symbolism of the coming of the Antichrist. The red horse, the symbolism, I think, of the Russian invasion. And the pale horse, the symbolism for famine and disease. And then you had the black horse, which indicated the great death and destruction that will come as a result of the famine. And then you come down to verse 12, and he opens the 6th seal. Now remember, there are 7, but the 7th one we'll cover a little later, because it's going to introduce the other trumpet judgments that will follow after the midpoint. But I want you to see now that this 6th seal is at the midpoint of the tribulation. And I beheld, and when he had opened the 6th seal, lo, there was a great earthquake. And the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. Now, of course, I think what you've really got pictured here is that as a result of the cataclysmic events of earthquakes and probably volcanoes, you're going to, as we've often seen, the moon will just turn red as blood because of all the pollution in the air. The sun will actually be blackened out because of it. And now we're going to pick up the intervening verses at a later time, but now come all the way down to verse 17 in this chapter 6. Remember, now first there's going to be a great earthquake. Now this is at the midpoint. There's going to be a specific earthquake. And now you come down to come. Now I think Scripture indicates that, like I said a program or two ago, the first 3.5 years are not going to be a Sunday school picnic. They're not going to be a utopia. Maybe just for a few months, the Antichrist is going to seem to have everything under control. But the remainder of that 3.5 years is going to get progressively worse. The war and the invasion in Israel and all the attending famine and so forth, it's already beginning to crescendo. And then when you come to the midpoint, I haven't got my line up there, but when you get to the midpoint of the 7 years, here comes this great earthquake. We've already seen the 2 witnesses resurrected and ascended, all probably within a matter of 72 hours or 3 or 4 days or whatever, but at the midpoint. And now verse 17 says, for the day of his wrath is come. In other words, that last 3.5 years. The one that Matthew 24 said was worse than any other period in all of human history. All right, now come over to chapter 11 here in Revelation. Revelation chapter 11. Now, in order to pick up the timing again, I always have to take this slowly, or people say, well, now, where do you get that this is the midpoint? How do you know it isn't at some other time? Well, remember when we were studying the two witnesses several programs ago? Verse 3, where God says, I will give power unto my two witnesses, and they shall prophesy or speak forth 1,260 days. How long is that? 3.5 years. All right, then as they finish their testimony, they're put to death, remember. And they're resurrected, verse 11. 3 days later, the Spirit of life from God entered into them. They stood upon their feet. And now you come to verse 12. They heard a great voice from heaven saying, come up hither. And they ascended up to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies beheld them. Now that's the midpoint. That's the end of the 1,260 days. Now you go right into the next verse and what it say? And the same hour, see? So we're at the midpoint. At the same hour there was a great earthquake. See how that fits with chapter 6 back in Revelation? There's going to be a great earthquake. Well, here it's repeated. And there shall be a great earthquake. The 10th part of the city fell, and in the earthquake there were slain of men. Now I think it's predominantly Jews in the area of Jerusalem. There were slain of men 7,000, and the, what's that next word? Remnant. See that? And the remnant were affrighted. In other words, God's got their attention now, and they were affrighted and gave glory to the God of heaven. Now here's where I always have to tell my classes, now be careful. A religious Jew today doesn't have any trouble giving glory